I want to talk to you about something that lives inside some of us, something I've been carrying for as long as I can remember. It's this profound ache that sits deep in the chest, deeper than anything you can name or point to. Some people walk through life and they don't know what I'm talking about. They hear these words and it sounds abstract, maybe even melodramatic. But then there are others who hear this and something in them recognizes it immediately. They know exactly what I mean because they carry it too. My life is good. I need to say that right from the start because this isn't about complaining or suggesting that everything is falling apart. I have people who care about me deeply. I care about them just as much. I'm not worried about where my next meal comes from or whether I can keep a roof over my head. I have children who make me laugh. My health is mostly solid. I get to do work that matters to me. I even have time to play games and enjoy myself. Almost any reasonable measure, my life is genuinely wonderful. And yet, despite all of this goodness, despite everything being okay, or even better than okay, there's something down there that hurts. It hurts constantly. It doesn't fade when good things happen. It doesn't diminish when I achieve something or when someone tells me they love me. It's just there, always like a stone at the bottom of a well. When I first mentioned this feeling in passing during another conversation, the response surprised me. So many people wrote to tell me they understood completely. They described the exact same sensation. What struck me most was that many of these people had done the work. They had gone to therapy. They had processed their trauma. They had made real, measurable progress in their lives. They had healed in ways that were observable and significant. And still remained, I work with people professionally, helping them through their struggles. And I see this pattern constantly. It's one of the most fascinating aspects of what I do. Someone comes in with a clear diagnosis. Maybe they've experienced severe trauma and they're dealing with all the aftermath of that. Their nervous system is completely dysregulated. The smallest trigger sends them into panic mode. Their body is constantly flooded with stress hormones. They can't sleep properly. They startle easily. Their baseline state is hypervigilance. These are real physiological changes that happen in the body after trauma. Or maybe someone comes in with crushing depression. We know that certain parts of their brain are working overtime in all the wrong ways. The regions responsible for experiencing negative emotions are lit up like a Christmas tree. They have these thought patterns that loop endlessly. The same beliefs play over and over like a broken record. I'm worthless. Nothing will ever get better. There's no point in trying. These thoughts aren't just passing ideas. They're carved deep into the architecture of how this person thinks about themselves and the world. The beautiful thing, the thing that makes this work meaningful, is that these conditions respond to treatment. We have methods that work, evidence-based approaches that help people heal from trauma, that lift people out of depression, that stabilize mood disorders. I've watched people transform. I've seen someone who could barely leave their house start living again. Watched the light come back into someone's eyes after months of darkness. But here's what keeps me up at night. Here's what I find myself thinking about long after someone has left my office. Even after all that healing, even after we've addressed the trauma and stabilized the mood and challenged the cognitive distortions, there's often something that remains. It's not the depression. It's not the anxiety. It's not the trauma response. It's something else entirely. I had someone I worked with for a long time who had what we call borderline personality disorder. One of the core features of this condition is a profound sense of emptiness. Most people move through the world with some stable sense of who they are. They know their likes and dislikes. They have a continuous sense of self that persists even when circumstances change. People with this condition often describe feeling hollow at their core, like there's a void where their sense of self should be. We worked together for months using approaches that have strong research backing them. And this person got better. Genuinely, significantly better. They started building a life they wanted. They began experiencing joy again. Their emotions became more stable. Their thinking became clearer. They took up practices like yoga and Tai Chi. They were doing all the right things and seeing real results. Then one day they came in for what had become a monthly check-in and told me about a conversation they'd had with their grandfather. They had been explaining to him about all the progress they'd made, about how much had changed. But then they mentioned that the emptiness they used to feel had shifted into something different. It wasn't quite emptiness anymore. It had become this deep sense of suffering, this H that persisted. Despite everything else getting better, their grandfather looked at them and said something that stopped them cold. He told them he'd had that exact same feeling his entire life, had never gone away. It was just part of who he was. He said there are some of us who carry this thing inside and it doesn't get better. It's just the nature of how we're built. That's just how life is for people like us. Now, I need to be honest with you about something. What I'm describing isn't something we fully understand from a scientific perspective. I can't pull out a textbook and show you the chapter on this. Can't point to a randomized, controlled trial that explains exactly what this is and how to fix it. This is territory where I have to piece together different ideas, different frameworks, different ways of understanding human experience. And even then, I'm not sure I have complete answers. Think about it this way. Most people, maybe 70 or 80% of the population, live their emotional lives in a particular range. They have thoughts and feelings that stay relatively close to the surface. Something good happens, they feel happy. When something frustrating occurs at work, they feel annoyed. When a relationship ends, they go through a period of sadness, and then they gradually return to their baseline. Sometimes these people develop conditions like depression or anxiety, and when they get treatment, they genuinely recover. But then there are others, maybe 20 or 30% of people. And in these individuals, there's something operating at a completely different level. It's not on the surface with the day-to-day emotions. It's way down deep, far below the level where normal healing happens. You can address everything at the surface level, and this thing doesn't budge. It just sits there unchanging, waiting. The second thing I notice about this deep feeling is its intensity. I've been trying to think of the right word to describe it. Energy feels too vague and loaded with connotations I don't intend. What I mean is that this thing has weight. It has density. It has substance. Sometimes I'll be doing absolutely nothing, just sitting quietly, and I'll become aware of this ache deep in my chest. It's heavy. It's profound. And here's what's strange. Sometimes this ache almost feels good. Not good in the sense of pleasant, but good in the sense that it adds something to life. It creates depth. I find myself drawn to incredibly sad music. I actually enjoy feeling sad sometimes. I think many people who carry this thing have a complicated relationship with sadness. We're not afraid of it the way some people are. We might even seek it out in certain ways because it connects us to this deep part of ourselves. I've also noticed that this deep place seems connected to a powerful capacity for compassion. Sometimes people approach me and tell me they feel a connection, that they love me even though we've just met. And when someone says that, I find myself responding genuinely. I tell them I love them too, and I mean it. In that moment, there's this recognition of shared humanity that feels profound and real. I think this capacity comes from the same place as the ache. I've seen this in people who create art. Musicians, painters, writers. Many of them describe how certain medications that stabilize their mood also cut them off from this deep place. They're grateful for the stability. They don't miss the depression or the mania, but they mourn the loss of access to this other thing, this deep well they could draw from. It's strange because that deep place doesn't feel good. It's painful. But somehow it adds richness and meaning to life that's hard to replace. The third thing about this deep feeling is that it doesn't improve with healing. If anything, it can become more pronounced as you get healthier in other ways. When someone is actively struggling with mental illness, this deep thing can get tangled up with all the symptoms. The depression, the anxiety, the trauma responses, they all mix together with this core ache and make everything worse. But as you peel away those layers through treatment, as you address the actual illnesses, this other thing becomes more visible. It stands out more clearly. I've sat with people who are recovering from depression and they can articulate the difference. They can say, okay, this part right here, this is the depression. I can see how my thinking gets distorted. I can recognize when the negative thoughts aren't reflecting reality. I can identify when my neurotransmitters are probably out of balance. But then there's this other element, down deeper, because that doesn't fit into those categories. That thing never changes regardless of how well they're doing. When I started trying to understand what this might be, I went looking in some unusual places. Standard psychiatric textbooks don't really address this. Treatment manuals for various disorders don't mention it. Ended up exploring some more theoretical territory, looking at psychoanalytic ideas that don't always make it into mainstream clinical practice. There's a thinker who wrote about something he called unformulated experience. His idea was that the unconscious mind isn't just a repository of specific memories and wounds that have a fixed shape. Instead, he proposed that some of our psychological material exists in a kind of uncrystallized state, raw potential that hasn't taken a specific form yet. He described it as psychological content that doesn't have an explicit, knowable shape, but that could take many possible forms as it eventually gets formulated through our lived experience. According to this view, perception and thought and feeling emerge from vagueness into clarity over time. We have this primitive psychological substance that gradually takes shape as we live and grow and have experiences. Maybe what I'm calling the deep ache is this unformulated material. Maybe it's like clay that hasn't been molded yet. Maybe as we move through life, it slowly takes on more definition. I find this idea interesting. I'm not entirely convinced it explains what I'm experiencing. It's possible, though. There's something about how the H becomes more profound over time, how it seems to gain definition as other parts of life improve that could fit with this model of psychological material gradually crystallizing into form. Another possibility is that this deep feeling represents a very early trauma. Think about how psychological injuries work. When something harmful happens to us, the way that experience gets encoded in our mind depends on our developmental stage at the time. 3-year-old child experiences something overwhelming. Their brain doesn't have the capacity to process it the way an adult brain would. They don't have language sophisticated enough to create a narrative around what happened. They don't have abstract concepts to make sense of the experience. So the injury gets laid down in a very primitive form. If I work with someone who was traumatized as a teenager or adult, that wound will have more structure to it. Take the form of specific beliefs. I'm ugly. I'm worthless. No one will ever love me. These are cognitive structures that a more developed mind creates. But a very young child doesn't think in those terms. Their pain exists at a more fundamental level before language, before concepts. It's just raw experience. Maybe the deep ache is a wound from very early childhood, from a time before we could make sense of things in adult ways. Maybe something happened when we were 2 or 3 or 4 that left this primitive scar. I've considered this possibility seriously, but I'm not fully convinced by it either, because I've worked with plenty of people on healing early trauma. And while that work is valuable and important, the deep ache often remains even after that healing is done. There's another framework that might apply here, something we're learning more about from genetics and biology. We now know that certain kinds of psychological experiences can leave marks that get passed down through generations. This isn't about changing the actual genetic code. The DNA sequence stays the same, but the way that genetic code gets expressed can change in response to severe experiences, and those changes can be inherited. We've seen this in studies of people whose parents or grandparents survived extreme trauma. The descendants can show signs of stress responses even though they never experienced the original trauma themselves. Think about the intense suffering of one generation can echo in the next through these biological mechanisms. I've had experiences in meditation that relate to this. I know how this sounds. People will think I've gone off the deep end, but I need to tell you what I've actually experienced, not what I think I'm supposed to say. During meditation, I've encountered a profound sense of loss, not a hypothetical sense of loss, not an imagined scenario. A real, visceral knowing of what it feels like to lose a child. I've never lost a child in this life, but I carry this grief, this specific wound, that feels completely real to me. For a long time, I tried to make sense of this. Maybe I was just making it up. Maybe my brain was creating a story, but the feeling has such weight and specificity to it. It's not vague or abstract. It's the particular grief of a mother who has lost a child. And then I learned that people in my family, generations before me, did lose children. My grandmother's generation experienced losses like that. If her grief changed something in her biology, in the way her genes were expressed, is it possible that change got passed to me? Could I be carrying her wound, not as a memory, but as something encoded in my cells? I was raised in a culture that includes ideas about reincarnation and karma. I was skeptical of all that for most of my life. I thought it was superstition. But then I started meditating seriously, not as a spiritual practice, but as a way to understand my own mind. And I kept having these experiences that didn't fit into my atheistic, materialist worldview. I kept encountering this deep pain that seemed to have nothing to do with anything that had happened in my current life. The texts I was reading described techniques for exploring past lives. I tried them fully expecting nothing to happen. I was essentially testing whether this was real or made up. And what I found was that as I did these practices, deep ache started to take on more form. Sensations and feelings that had always been vague started to crystallize into something more specific. I started to understand myself as someone who had experienced this profound loss before in a different life, in a different body. I can't prove any of this. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm just telling you what my direct experience has been. And I'm offering it as one possible explanation for where the deep ache comes from. Maybe some of us are carrying wounds from previous lives. Maybe consciousness persists in ways we don't understand, and sometimes the pain persists too. Where's one more framework I want to share with you, and this one comes from Buddhist meditation traditions. In the 8th century, wrote a beautiful text about advanced stages of spiritual practice. The text describes something that happens to people who meditate very seriously over long periods of time. In the early stages of practice, meditation is about achieving tranquility. You're working with anger, sadness, attachment, ego. You're trying to find inner peace. You're learning not to be controlled by comparison and jealousy and all the difficult emotions that make life painful. Something interesting happens as people progress on this path, as they start to achieve that inner peace. As they get better at letting go of their personal suffering, a new kind of pain emerges. The text calls it the wound of compassion. It's not the same as the anxiety and depression they were working with before. It's something else entirely. It's a profound ache that comes from feeling the suffering of all beings, not just your own suffering. The text describes this with incredible precision. It says that your pain is your own, and yet you cling to it and make it hard to bear. The pain of others, which doesn't directly harm you, becomes equally hard to bear once you take it as your own. Once you recognize that others want happiness just as much as you do, that others are fleeing from suffering just as desperately as you are, their pain becomes inseparable from yours. The writing gets even more intense. It talks about giving everything away, not counting the cost, dedicating your entire being to the benefit of others. It describes a willingness to let others use you, even hurt you, if that somehow reduces their suffering. Now, I'm not saying we should all literally let people harm us. That's not the point. What I want you to consider is the depth of feeling that would lead someone to write words like that. Kind of ache must they be carrying to feel that level of compassion, that degree of connection to others' pain. As I've become more stable in my own life, as I've healed my own wounds and built something solid, my compassion has intensified. I feel other people's pain more acutely than ever. When I encounter someone who's struggling, it hits me hard. Not in a way that destabilizes me, in a way that feels meaningful and important. And I wonder whether this is what those old texts were describing. Maybe the deep ache and the wound of compassion are the same thing. Maybe as we heal ourselves, we become more porous to the suffering of the world. What I've noticed, this is something I've seen again and again, both in myself and in others, leaning into the deep ache actually gives us power in the world. I know that sounds strange. You'd think that connecting with pain would make you weaker, more fragile. But it's the opposite. When I allow myself to feel that deep place fully, when I stop trying to manage it or minimize it or explain it away, something shifts. I have more to give. I create better work. I connect with people more genuinely. Some of my patients who are artists describe this exactly. When they write music or paint, the best work comes from that deep place. They hate losing access to it, even though accessing it means feeling pain. The pain and the creativity are somehow linked. Depth and the hurt are intertwined. For me, it shows up in work like this. I look around and see 8 billion people on this planet, most of whom are suffering in some way, most of whom don't have good answers for why they feel the way they feel or what to do about it. I don't have perfect answers either. I'm not standing here as some enlightened being who has figured everything out. I'm as confused as anyone about what the deep ache really is, where it comes from, why some of us carry it and others don't. I feel this compulsion to try anyway, even if I get it wrong. Even if this helps no one, even if I'm just throwing ideas into the void and none of them stick, I have to make the attempt because the deep ache demands it. It's not really a choice. The hurt connects me to something larger than myself, to all the other people who are hurting, and that connection creates obligation. I think about the people who wrote those ancient texts about compassion. They were describing something they actually experienced, not something theoretical. They felt the suffering of all beings as their own suffering. They couldn't separate their pain from everyone else's pain. And maybe that's not a bug. Maybe that's not something that needs to be fixed. Maybe for some of us, that's just how we're wired. We're supposed to feel this way. I don't know if the deep ache comes from unformulated experience that's slowly crystallizing. I don't know if it's early childhood trauma that happened before we had language. I don't know if it's epigenetic inheritance from ancestors who suffered. I don't know if it's wounds from past lives that somehow persist through death and rebirth. I don't know if it's the wound of compassion described in contemplative traditions. Maybe it's all of these things. Maybe it's none of them. Maybe it's something else entirely that we don't have words or concepts for yet. What I do know is that it's real. It's not something we're making up. It's not just unprocessed trauma that would resolve with the right therapy. It's not depression wearing a different mask. It exists in its own category, deep below the level where conventional healing happens. Trying to understand it, trying to articulate what it feels like, trying to find others who recognize it, this matters. Not because we're going to make it go away. Maybe we're not supposed to make it go away. But because naming something, sharing it, knowing we're not alone in carrying it, that changes the experience of it. If you recognize what I'm describing, if you've felt this deep ache yourself, then you understand the strange gift of it. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it's heavy. Yes, it never leaves. But it also connects us to something profound. It gives us depth and meaning. It opens our hearts to others in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise. It drives us to create, to help Try to reduce suffering even when we're not sure we can. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to fully understand it or cure it or explain it away. Maybe we just need to acknowledge it exists, honor what it asks of us, and let it shape us into people who can hold both our own pain and the pain of others with equal care. Maybe the deep ache is how some of us are meant to move through the world, carrying this weight that also somehow makes us stronger, feeling this hurt that also somehow makes us more human, more connected, more alive to what really matters. That's what I believe. Anyway, that's what my experience has taught me. And I'm still learning. We're all still learning. That's okay. We'll figure it out together, one conversation at a time, one shared recognition at a time, until slowly this thing that seemed impossible to name becomes something we all understand.